The first time I walked into a nursing home, I thought I knew what loneliness looked like. I expected quiet rooms, empty stairs, maybe the occasional sigh drifting down the hallway. But loneliness inside those walls had many faces, and over 5 years of visits, I learned it could hide behind a smile as easily as it could sit in silence. At Brookfield Manor, the first place I visited, I met Edith. She was 86, with white hair pinned neatly at the back of her head and a string of pearls around her neck every morning. She laughed easily, asked about my day, told me stories of the bakery she'd run with her husband decades earlier. But one afternoon, when I stopped by without warning, I found her sitting in her chair by the window, hands still, eyes fixed on the car park below. She didn't notice me until I spoke. She admitted she hadn't had a visitor in months. "You talk to me," she said, "but you get to leave." I began to see a pattern. Residents often had company in the mornings, staff bustling in and out, delivering breakfast trays, helping them dress. But afternoons stretched into long, empty hours. Those who could still walk would gather in the common room, where the TV was always on, but rarely watched. They would sit in a loose circle, not speaking much, each of them pretending the flickering screen was enough. There were the talkers, like George at Rosewood Care, who greeted me with a flood of words every time I arrived. He told me about his youth, his children, the fishing trips he used to take. But if I stayed long enough, his stories would loop back to the same ones I'd heard before, told almost word for word. I realized it wasn't the content that mattered. He wasn't telling me because he thought I needed to know. He was telling me because saying the words out loud made him feel real, made his memories live again for a little while. Then there were the quiet ones, like Mrs. Lee, who rarely spoke in English and preferred to stay in her room. I once brought her a small pot of jasmine tea, and she poured us both a cup without saying a word. We sat together for nearly an hour in silence, the faint scent of flowers filling the space. Later, a nurse told me her husband had died years ago, and her children lived in another country. The silence wasn't coldness. It was the absence of someone who understood her without translation. 5 years taught me that loneliness wasn't always about being alone. Some residents had children who visited every week, but those visits often felt like a ritual more than a connection. I watched a daughter sit with her mother for an hour, scrolling on her phone between brief bursts of conversation. The mother smiled politely, but when the door closed behind her daughter, she sighed and stared at the floor. Presence without attention was just another kind of absence. The staff often tried to fill the gaps with activities, bingo, craft afternoons, sing-alongs. And for a while, it seemed to help. Laughter around the tables, bursts of conversation. But as soon as the chairs were stacked and the markers put away, the room emptied. The noise faded, and the quiet settled back in like dust. The events were a spark, but sparks alone couldn't keep anyone warm. I also saw how loneliness could push people to cling to the smallest connections. In one home, a woman named Margaret began waiting for me in the hallway each week. She'd watch for the front doors to open, then take my arm as if we were old friends. Once, when I asked about her family, she told me they were busy, but she had plenty of company here. Yet her grip on my sleeve tightened every time I tried to leave. There was a sharp edge to loneliness, too. Some residents became suspicious or resentful, convinced others were stealing from them or talking behind their backs. I met a man named Arthur who accused the staff of hiding his mail. In truth, there was no mail. His sister had stopped writing years ago. Anger, I realized, was sometimes easier to carry than the weight of being forgotten. And yet, loneliness could make people kinder. In one wing of a care home, I saw how 3 women, who had no family left, began treating each other like sisters. They ate together, shared books, and even sat outside in the cold just to keep one another company. When one of them passed away, the other 2 began saving her seat in the dining hall for weeks afterward, as if she might return any day. Over time, I noticed the residents who seemed to weather loneliness best were those who still had a role to play. A man named Henry polished the dining room's salt and pepper shakers every morning. A retired teacher named Joan ran an informal reading group, even though most members couldn't remember the previous chapter. These small tasks gave them purpose, a reason for each day to begin. I learned that what many of them missed most wasn't just family or friends. It was the rhythm of ordinary life. They missed deciding when to make tea, choosing what to eat, or answering a knock on the door and finding a neighbor there. In the homes, life was safe, but it was scheduled. Meals arrived at the same time, lights went out at the same time. Even conversations seemed to have a set pattern. Without variety, days blurred together, and loneliness settled in the spaces where spontaneity used to be. Sometimes, breaking that pattern made all the difference. I once brought in a box of old postcards to share with residents at Maple Grove. We spent the afternoon passing them around, imagining who might have sent them, making up stories about the people in the faded photographs. For a few hours, the common room felt alive, like a kitchen table surrounded by friends. Weeks later, people were still talking about those postcards. But the hardest truth I learned was this: not everyone wanted saving. Some had made peace with their solitude. I met a woman named Ruth who spent most days knitting in her room with the radio on low. She told me she had been lonely in her marriage, lonely raising children who never seemed to understand her, and now she was simply used to it. She didn't want visitors or activities, just the comfort of her own quiet corner. Loneliness, for her, was no longer an enemy, but a familiar companion. When I finally stepped away from my regular visits, I carried their faces with me: the talkers and the silent ones, the hopeful and the resigned. Loneliness in nursing homes wasn't a single problem to be solved. It was a landscape, varied and complicated, shaped by each person's history, losses, and expectations. I learned that small moments mattered more than grand gestures. Sitting down without checking the time, listening to the same story again without rushing it, remembering a birthday, asking someone for advice, not because you needed it, but because it reminded them they still had wisdom to give. 5 years of listening, watching, and sometimes just sitting in silence taught me this: loneliness doesn't always come from being forgotten. Sometimes it comes from being seen only as someone to care for, not as someone who still has something to offer. And in those quiet hallways, the greatest gift anyone could bring was not just presence, but recognition, an acknowledgement that the person sitting across from you was still fully there, still themselves, still part of the world outside those walls.